Oh, kids are blowing bubbles.
Welcome to another episode of the Caribbean Edge. We're actually live. So I appreciate everyone tuning in once again. It's a Wednesday, 8 p.m. here in Florida. Of course, we have viewers all around the world. So thank you no matter where you are, what time you're tuning in. And tonight's topic is, do all Black Lives Matter? And I want to thank Dr. Lisa Gunderson for this particular topic, who is joining us for the second time on the Caribbean Edge. So we also have some amazing guests. We have Kishi, and we also have Dr. Ursula Wright as well. So I'm just going to start out by asking you guys, how are you dealing with COVID-19? What's going on where you are? How are you dealing with it in this environment?
Well, in Miami, we're kind of in trouble down on these ends. The numbers are going up rapidly because, you know, of course, they've opened everything up. And so a lot of things are still in disarray. I'm the dean and owner of a private school, but we're kind of just really trying to figure out what's going to happen in August. A lot of the county schools are trying to really figure out how we're going to navigate. And so there's just, I would say, a lot of chaos, and we're trying to bring it under, you know, organization. So that's what's happening on our end, in addition to the heat. It is absolutely hot here in Miami.
I can attest to that. Kishi, how are you doing?
Well, I'm glad to be back. This is also my second time. And how I've been dealing since the pandemic began. Well, I work at a clinic, and we have still remained open throughout, and it's been very challenging adjusting to just having distance. Also changing how we communicate with each other, not just having a lot of Zoom meetings, but, you know, coworkers and colleagues, we're not hugging, we're not gathering as much. And there's definitely a lot of anxiety, and there's also so many unknowns. This is such a new thing, so young, that a lot of information and research is still happening in real time, and everyone's really on edge. But I've been doing my best to give time to things that make me happy, things I love, and people I love, and that has kept me focused.
Thank you. And Lisa, who is all the way in Canada, what's going on in Canada with COVID-19?
So I'm on the West Coast, and we in BC, in our province, they've been excellent in keeping things kind of under control. Everything is still quite locked down. They have begun to open up some restaurants minimally. Today is actually Canada Day, which is equivalent to the 4th of July. And so our block, for example, everybody has a table out, but people are physically distant, and everybody's kind of just staying in front of their garages. They still decided not to reopen the border between us and the United States. They've decided to keep that closed for at least another month through August because of what's happening over there. And yeah, I think we've been very cautious here in the Victoria side. There's a lot of stuff happening though on the East Coast, in Toronto and Montreal and other places like that as well.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and what's going on. Of course, Florida, where a lot of our viewers reside, we're seeing another 6,500 cases just today alone.
You opened too soon.
You know, we're seeing about 600 to 800 deaths in the United States of America per day. Hospitals around the country are reporting anywhere from 75 to 80%, 88% plus in Arizona of being at capacity. And now they're alerting young people. So a lot of changes. The age group of 20 to 44 make up 50% of COVID-19. So that's just saying, even though, you know, they may not feel very, very sick or get ill like a lot of people are or die from it, they're able to spread it. So a lot of cautions out there for young people to pay more attention to it. And like you mentioned, the bars opening up. So the third of the deaths around the world are from the United States. So these statistics are very alarming. I know my kids said to me, you know, when we have these discussions about staying home, they say, Mom, because you're over 35, we are doing this for you by staying home. So if you have some responsible kids, hopefully they're telling you that. And I heard a story today that I really want to talk about. It was, you know, one of my coworkers, and she said a friend of hers went to help someone who was a friend of, you know, a personal friend, just to help them around the house do stuff. This person knew they had COVID-19 and did not tell this friend that was helping him. Of course, he caught COVID-19. He died from COVID-19. And he gave it to his family as well. So it just tells you that you have to take personal responsibilities, no matter what, you know, by distancing yourself from your friends, taking the precautions, like Kishi said, it's difficult, it's challenging. We love to hug, we love to socialize and everything else, but we gotta do what's right. So thank you for being here tonight, and we're gonna dig deep. So I wanna do some quick introductions of everyone. So Dr. Lisa Gunderson, her second time on the Caribbean Edge, is a clinical psychologist, the owner of One Love Consulting, which specializes in anti-Black racism, equity training for schools and businesses. And she's also a tenured university professor, with one of the main courses was psychology of minorities, which included a focus of the SOGI groups, which was sexual orientation and gender identity. So thank you, Dr. Lisa Gunderson, for joining us again tonight.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And we have Kishi, who is the son of a personal friend who has become a friend and a follower, viewer, second time on the Caribbean Edge. So always a pleasure to have this young man join us. His personality outshines so many. And if you check him out on social media, he'll put up some dances, which always makes me laugh, Kishi, just so you know. But he's a community advocate, not just in the US, but worldwide. You know, he believes in the Black Lives Matter movement. And he has, you know, done a lot of things within the community. When he was on the show the last time, we talked about, you know, just protection throughout communities and what he was doing there. So we're gonna have Kishi expand on that as well, and some of the things that he has faced within the community with mental health is one of the subjects that he wants to touch on tonight. Very important topic for us all. And Dr. Ursula Wright, who I'm just meeting tonight on the show as well. She is actually born American and no Caribbean relation at all, which is so nice to have you on the show because you give us such a different perspective as well. But Dr. Wright has 18 years experience as a pastor, 19-year experience as an educator, a lifetime advocate for change. While touches many across broad spectrum, she's particularly concerned with the divide between the LGBTQ communities and the church's institutional response to women as victims of domestic violence within the church. She believes that the church and faith are significant keys to the transformation needed in the world. So thank you, all of you, for joining us tonight. So I want to ask you about Black Lives Matter and why you were interested in doing this particular topic, as far as, does it impact or affect all of us? Do we believe that?
Would like to go first.
I'll say something, because this is the conversation that we had. I was speaking at a BLM rally here. We had about 9,000 people there, and as people are shouting Black Lives Matter, I said every Black life matters, because one of the things that I think about is when we're out there talking about the police, for example, do we recognize the fact that the group that receives the most police discrimination and brutality are Black transgender women, for example, right? Do we recognize the fact that our lesbian and gay brothers and sisters, our bisexual, non-gender conforming brothers and sisters, that they are part of Black lives? And I wonder if within some of our communities, especially in the West Indies and in the Caribbean community and so forth, that the discrimination we tend to display to those groups of people, if they indeed, when they're shouting BLM, are they shouting for all of us, as they should be? And so that was what was of interest to me, is that we really need to be speaking about that. And as a Christian woman, I also strongly believe that that is a discussion that needs to be happening in all of our faith spaces, because there's a lot of discrimination that's happening under the guise of Christianity. And I have huge problems with that.
Okay.
I can probably echo, some of the things that you're sharing. Having been, in ministry for so long, I've been in church basically all my life. But one of the things I think progressively, as we see, I guess, and experience many of the changes in the world, we go through different, I guess, phases of what we consider civil rights, different phases of what we consider human rights. We have discussions around equality as well as equity. And then I think, for me, I think my passion around this particular topic, and I did a live, somewhat similar panel a few months ago, because I think one of the things that really concerns me, by being in academia and in education, one of the things that we do is we get a lot of training and development on a number of things. And I recall going to a training that helps the public schools to understand what to do with homeless youth. And one of the things that statistically we found was that a large population of homeless youth identified as LGBTQIA+. And so it really began to pique my interest, because I'm like, why do we have this widespread problem around homelessness, especially when you start to think of all of the things that then these young people would potentially be exposed to in the realm of human trafficking, sexual trafficking, and all of these sorts of things. So as an academic, I'm looking now at the research. What is the research saying? And then I began, I kind of think about some of the attitudes and some of the interactions that I've had with people of faith around the topic, and how, unfortunately, religion seems to wedge a divide even between parents and their kids.
Yeah.
And so when the child discloses to the parent that, hey, I'm gay, bisexual, whatever the identification is, then it's almost like the love of God that we're supposed to have, the grace of God we're supposed to have, all of a sudden that particular parent is placed in this position where they feel they have to choose. And so many children, before they're really of age to care for themselves properly, do anything, we began to find that I think it was over 70% of the youth that were homeless who identified as LGBTQIA+, came from the disclosure to families that were religious. And so for me, when I think biblically of the reason why he came, and the whole idea of why we marginalize individuals that Christ never marginalized, he was always with the individuals that others marginalize, but yet we have an entire system that now creates, I think, this breach and this wedge. And it literally, you know, some kids, they grow up and they're grown and they still don't have relationship with their parents. And I think for me, I believe that faith and Christianity, that we are in such a position, a powerful position, to be able to provide not only answers, hope, intervention, solutions, and care to all people, but I think that we have to reframe how we think and how we respond, even if we don't agree, even if individuals don't necessarily agree with a particular lifestyle choice. I do think that the way we've used religion to weaponize marginalized populations is a disservice. And so the reason that I'm here is to open up the types of conversation that we should be having as clergy, that we should be having as people of faith, to see how do we bridge the divide, how do we talk about equity, how do we talk about equality, how do we talk about things as basic as insurance provisions, education, access, and all of those sorts of things. You know, and I don't believe that we, in order to collaborate and solve problems, that we have to agree on everything. I think that it's impossible for any two people or any two groups to agree on everything. But on the basis of human life, I believe if we can promote, quote unquote, Black Lives Matter, or, you know, humanity, equity around these things, we cannot have or allow personal biases to interfere with those particular thought processes. So that's the reason I'm here. I'm here as a bridge to conversation.
Thank you. You raised some very interesting points, and I see Kishi waiting.
Yeah.
So
No, because
Kishi.
I just feel that both of you eloquently expressed so many things I agree with, and it just makes me want to talk about, obviously, a little bit of what I discussed last time I was here prior. I am of Caribbean descent. I am also a proud member of the LGBT community. And while my family has always been supportive and they've always been my rock, I, throughout grade school, faced a lot of discrimination, mostly from people who look like me. So mostly African-American and Caribbean-American men. And it was difficult because I was my masculinity was always attacked. My Blackness was always under attack. So becoming an adult and trying to figure out my identity, my self-worth, my value, it was very overwhelming, because amongst Black people, being who I am, I feel like I have to be more masculine. I feel like I have to show up a certain way. Same with being around just Caribbean people overall. There is a certain expectation that I felt I needed to portray, because I was constantly told you're not good enough.
Yeah.
You know, and then, but also within the LGBT community, as a person of color, as a person of African descent, as a Caribbean person, I face discrimination too.
Yeah.
There's that intersection, there's that overlap of having different identities, and trying to find the best to be proud of who you are and love who you are, but feeling inadequate and invalidated because you're not masculine enough, or for some people, you're too dark. So this journey in life has really led me to being here in 2020 in a crazy time where we are seeing in real time the death of George Floyd. I couldn't watch that video, that broke my heart. But hearing what happened and seeing some of what happened, I saw myself in that video.
Yeah.
And then going to 2 marches, I went to a Miami and a Fort Lauderdale march. I went there, I repped Jamaica, I repped the LGBT community. There were a lot of Caribbean people there. There were a lot of LGBT people there. And it was nice to see unification, but still there's that thing in the back of my head. Do I belong here? Would they fight for me? You know, like we saw that the US Supreme Court deemed it unconstitutional to fire someone based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, which was amazing. but that's just the United States. And even when these things come into play, like when these policies are passed, it doesn't erase discrimination. So while Black Lives Matter is, all Black lives do matter, no matter your skin complexion, no matter your sexual orientation or gender identity, they all do matter. However, there's a lot of, there's too much explaining to people who are not Black. And I think a lot of explanation or conversations internally among Black people need to happen, whether it's sexual orientation, abuse, whether it is homophobia, transphobia. These conversations have to happen, and they can all happen at the same time, because this is a movement that is going to benefit not just the US, because Black Lives Matter is not just a US thing. Black lives are in Caribbean, Central America, South America, Africa, Europe, everywhere. These conversations need to happen internally about what that looks like.
I wanted to mention just some straight kind of facts, because I think part of what happens in our community, I was in Jamaica a couple years ago, and one of the things that I heard somebody say is, you know, these groups are taking over and they're going to take over the world, and just there's just a lot of kind of, I think, misinformation about a lot of things. First, I just wanted to say, from a psychological perspective, the American Psychological Association from 1975 has been speaking about sexual orientation and gender identity, that these are core pieces to who you are as a person, and that it's very important for them to be recognized and be able to be expressed in order to minimize mental wellness problems. And so it's not surprising that we have young people, we have people within the communities having higher rates of things like depression and suicidality and these kind of things that are happening because of prejudice and discrimination. I really want to point out this idea of reparative or conversion therapy that became rampant, that you can do things to change who you are, that has been denounced by almost any type of mental wellness psychological association, that reparative or conversion therapy is neither safe nor effective. And it's one of these things that has caused a lot of people deep, deep grief and hurt and pain. And so it's really important that, you know, people don't engage in that type of therapy. That could be incredibly damaging, and it is not approved in any fashion whatsoever in the United States. It's really important to get that across. And I think that it's also important to recognize that, again, if you're part of the SOGI community, you are 2 times, for example, more likely to deal with physical violence, 2 times more likely to have discrimination happen to you. You're more likely to engage in threats. That's not just in the US, but in Canada, 13% of the population is in the SOGI category, and 75% say that they have been bullied or had threats or have dealt with kind of being name called in some way, that they face discrimination at work. 54% of people may not even say who they are because they're afraid of discrimination at work. So I'm just trying to point out that whether you're in Canada, whether you're in the United States, that this is a worldwide problem in terms of discrimination and prejudice, and it has real life impact on the mental wellness of our brothers and sisters, and it also has impact on issues of suicidality. And it's incredibly, incredibly important that we understand, those of us who are not gay, our role in perpetuating that, right? Our role in reinforcing those stereotypes and those biases, and not interrupting those conversations when we're with our aunts and our uncles and our friends, and people are starting to talk about gay people and we say nothing. We are contributing to the mental illness, wellness problems of our brothers and sisters and their deaths. And I mean that very strongly, that we have an absolute responsibility to dismantle those heterosexist systems and those oppressive systems, that's our duty to have to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Gunderson. So everyone has touched on some very key and important points that we certainly need to dig deeper into as well. I know Dr. Wright, who, thank you, Charlene Bowie, for introducing me to this lovely woman. I called her and she just said, yes, I am the perfect person for you for this topic. You know, you mentioned about, you know, the kids that are homeless. And I believe you said about 70% is because, you know, they've, you know, putting it bluntly, were rejected. And so it is, you're rejected by your parents. They don't accept the fact that their kid is gay. I think a lot of parents go through that. Okay, so I want to talk about parents. Because it starts in the home. Kishi mentioned, you know, he has a beautiful, amazing supporting system, you know, with the root being his mom, Andrea Hall, and that's so important, right? And I think, you know, I know as a parent, if one of my kids ever came to me and said, Mom, this is how I feel, then I'm one of those parents that absolutely I'm gonna support them. You know, we see D. Wade bringing him up into this conversation. I believe his daughter is 12 years old. And so, you know, they did a lot of research, not familiar with it. So it is worthwhile to do your research so you know how to support your kids. You know, being from the Caribbean, we have a very strong rooted history, even in today's society. So the US laws have changed somewhat, but there's still a lot of laws in Jamaica that have not changed. They're about, you know, Trinidad and Tobago recently in 2018 changed their buggery law there, where, you know, they could serve up to 10 years in prison for being with another man. Jamaica hasn't changed its laws.
Not at all.
Barbados hasn't changed its laws. Dominica, Grenada, people could face
just not safe.
10 years. Even though they're not enforced, these laws have been in place for 150 years and they're still there. So a lot of people live in the dark. They live in the closets, you know, because it's so difficult to come out because people have been killed over it.
That's
I
right.
know my beloved Jamaica was, you know, classed as the worst country on the planet when it comes to dealing with homosexuality. And it starts with our leaders as well, because our leaders have also said, not in my cabinet, the Honorable Bruce Golding has said that. So not just targeting Jamaica, but that's my personal experience. And that stood out to me and has stood out to me over the years. I know previous Prime Minister Portia Simpson had come out and she said she was open. She didn't have any issues with that. And I respected her for saying that, because it starts there. So let's talk a little bit about the home, which Kishi talked about, having that supportive parenting there. And what are you seeing and what difference, or share any experiences or examples that you may have working with people that did not have that support system versus the ones that do?
Well, I would just like to say, for years I worked at I still volunteer with local organizations in both Broward and Miami-Dade, and it was eye-opening. Weekly, both organizations that I volunteered for would have drop-in center, group night, and so many children from every walk of life, from every ethnic group. Most of them would come there for support. And many of them were rejected, and many of them shared their trauma, and for many of them, it was the only safe place for them. A lot of kids would come there and that was the only meal they had, or they would come and that was the only place that they would feel safe to hug somebody, or many of them who wish to transition or wish to change their pronouns. that was the only place where those things would be validated. Whereas when they go home, they don't have that same support. And I would say more often than not, usually the home was not a safe place, and several types of abuse were happening within the home, whether it was physical, sexual, emotional, mental, as well as the school. But what I do know, I am not a parent, but my experiences with communicating with the parents, for many of them, it's fear. They were taught to be homophobic and transphobic. Like, heterosexism is when, you know, heterosexuality and anything related to it is the norm. So however that may look in one person's household, it's not the same all around. Like, for some people, oh, okay, you think you're gay or bisexual or trans or lesbian, cool, let's talk about it. For some people, they grew up hearing negative things constantly about that gay relative, or and I think also representation matters too, right? Because a lot of the representation that we see on media with images of the LGBT community, it's usually effeminate gay white men. And we know, especially when it comes to men, how important masculinity is. So if their son is, you know, showing effeminate traits, they get hell. Even though women dressing or presenting masculine is more acceptable than a man dressing feminine, there's a lot of women who get trouble and get a lot of flack for presenting masculine or not being soft or submissive enough. And these are all things that I noticed with these families. And there were some families who were teachable. Like, I get that the terminology is ever evolving. There's a lot of terms, there's a lot of, like, being in the LGBT community is very, very, it's a very diverse world with a lot of subcultures and a lot of subgroups. So this generation, you know, they're coming out younger and they're coming out very well informed. It is so difficult for when you have a parent who grew up in the 80s or the 90s or the 70s, and they have these very black and white, gay, straight only. There is no spectrum. There is no gray area. Male, female, there is no switching.
Yeah.
It takes time, but there are people who are teachable and there are people who are not. But the children definitely benefit when, even if the parent is initially hesitant, once the parent takes the time to learn and can make steps, once they're teachable and willing to learn, that relationship does benefit from it. But when they are stagnant and firm and like, I do not support you at all, I do not accept you at all, it's the negative impact. I mean, it doesn't need an explanation. On the child, the impact is really bad.
So do you, any of you, understand why parents would be hesitant?
So as a parent, I have 2 boys. I think when I've had parents and friends who've struggled, the couple issues that come up for them, one is fear. It's like, as Kishi mentioned, and the fear comes from 2 places. One, a fear of not knowing what this means. Because when you talk about a community, for example, transgender community, you're talking about less than 1%, right? 1 to 2%. And if you look at the gay community, maybe 3 to 5% overall, but in certain cities, it could be as high as 10%, 15%, right? And so you have, and then when you look at within the Black community itself, there's not a lot of good examples of people who've come out. Like when people hear about James Baldwin, for example, or something like that, like we don't do proper education at all. And so for a parent, I think the fear is from 2 different spaces. It's one of, I don't understand, I'm not sure, I can't wrap my head around it. And if we are honest as parents, many times when our children are born, many parents have dreams that they start, right? Like some are like, oh, mine's is going to be a doctor, mine's going to be a lawyer, and my kid is going to get married to this kind of person and this and that. And so when kids get older and they say something or something happens where that disrupts that for parents, I think that is a piece of it as well. And then there's some genuine fear where there's some parents who are accepting, but then they're scared of what it means for their child. And so imagine that you're in Jamaica and your child tells you he's gay. And you're accepting of that, but you understand that that now puts his life in danger, and not in a joking kind of ha-ha danger way, like he could get killed kind of way. And so for some parents, if they don't have proper supports and outlets and spaces where they can go and figure out how to make that safe, for some parents, they would rather tell their child, you have to stay undercover. I don't want something to happen to you. And so there is this real life fear that is involved with that. But I think at the end of the day, we really have to talk about how deeply entrenched we have been trained, and our prejudices and biases, especially in the Black community, around gay persons and around the Soji community. And we don't do anything very active in our communities to undo those stereotypes, to undo those prejudices. We're not actively having these conversations within our small selves, in our small groups, in our churches, in our communities and spaces. And I think that's a huge problem, is that we don't really talk about just downright transphobic, homophobic prejudices that we have. And I think that's really a real problem. And I don't think people know where to go. I mean, they can figure out where to go, right? You could figure that out, but you have to put effort into it. And I don't know if people are willing to do that.
And I would add one other perspective. I love how you phrased it all, Lisa. There's one other thing that I was thinking of, and it's the shame. The shame that we think, and some of it is reality. It's like you bring embarrassment on the family.
Which is back to the prejudice.
And I think that's a huge thing, and it's worldwide, but I know it's embedded in the Caribbean, because even as a parent, if you accept it and you want the best for your kid and you want to support it, one of the things you think about is what kind of shame you're going to face with your friends, and how
will they view you and judge you.
But why is that shame there, right? Like, why is that shameful?
It was the same with AIDS. If my friends know you have AIDS, they won't even come to my house, or they won't even drink from a glass.
And look what happened with that, because of that shame and embarrassment. And we know this personally because we lost an aunt, then we don't go seek help and we can't talk. And my cousin in Jamaica who deals with a pharmacy is sneaking around trying to give people medication so people can't find out who has AIDS, because it puts their lives in danger. But that's the thing, is why aren't we why is that shameful? Why is that embarrassing for us? That's what I'm saying is the conversations we need to have, because it doesn't make sense that it should be shameful or embarrassing for us.
I think Dr. Lisa too, though, I know that that's definitely probably the context and the broader scheme of things, but I think it's even more, stressful and more of that shame and embarrassment when we do consider the faith-based community. And so one of the things that you kept talking about was, why is that shame there? Because, I think we have, well, at least from the standpoint that I'm coming from, when we talk about faith and we talk about God and we talk about Christianity, and, there's a script of values that, we subscribe to and we talk about, and, we have kind of like this layout. And so when you're confronted with, and when families are confronted with this type of issue, not only is it just personal embarrassment because we consider it as, abnormal or not normal or sin or whatever it is, but there is, I think the thing sometimes that we don't realize is that people of faith really come to terms with, like, my value system in my own house now is being challenged. You understand what I'm saying? And so where people have thought a certain way the whole, this whole time, it's easier when your best friend is dealing with it or someone else is dealing with it. But when it shows up in your space, now you have to decide where your values really lie. And so this is not just, okay, I'm embarrassed by who you are and what you've become, but now I really have to go through some soul searching, some soul digging to see if I'm now going to change sides, or how am I going to play both sides, or how am I going to still believe what I believe, but support you as my son, daughter, or however you identify. And so the conflict and the tension within for parents is a lot deeper. And so, just in I guess, talking with parents, and then I think one of the other things that one of you talked about was, to the level of ignorance, like, okay, what do I do now? What do I do with this? I don't understand it. And if I have, I guess, years and years of understanding under one dynamic, whether it's that, God doesn't make mistakes and it's impossible for you to be born this way, so you automatically assume where this must be a choice. So then you think you can undo the choice. And so there are a lot of conflicting things that happen in a parent's mind, especially if they're a parent of faith. So it's almost like for them, like a crisis all in one at the moment. And so the reality is, and I think one of the things that we don't realize, too, as African-American community, a lot of times, I don't know as much how it is in the Caribbean community, but we are not taught to resolve conflict well. We normally are not taught to resolve conflict, to address issues. In certain ways, we either shut down, we walk away. We have family secrets, we hide it, we stuff it, we don't talk about it. And so it is not normal in most households, unfortunately, that African-American, for conflict and for this level of discussion, communication, and understanding to really be as present as we would want it to be. And I think too that a lot of the other things that are grappled around or are attention points too in the faith community is that I think, though, as we are looking for solutions and as we're looking for a bridge, I know that the faith community has not always handled or responded to this issue well. But what I do also feel like sometimes within the context of the discussion, as it relates to the faith-based community, there's also not a space for the faith-based community to also talk and dialogue in these settings because we have done so much damage already. And so it's kind of like, how do we come to this place of solution between the LGBTQIA community and the faith-based community is that both sides have to be heard. So I know there's an expectation that we understand all of the things that are going on over here, but I do know that a lot of clergy, a lot of pastors, a lot of families feel like that there is somewhat of reverse discrimination in not being able at least to dialogue and share, well, these are our perspectives, or this is why, these sort of things are happening. So the healthy dialogue that needs to happen, like between people like me on my side and your side, is the space has to be made for both. Because while I believe all of these things and thought processes are valid on the LGBTQIA side, I think that when people have a certain value system or belief system, that they should also be heard too. And I think if we each side keeps silencing the other side, then we're never going to get to the table and say, okay, man, I understand that, but do you realize how this has really harmed our community? And I think that the whole end goal is this massive form, I believe, of reconciliation, but we can't do it if we muffle both sides. And I think that if we don't allow at least the faith-based community to be heard and parents to be heard in terms of what they're going through, then we're not going to be able to come up with solutions, I think, that make sense for everybody and creates a safe space for everybody. So I just kind of want to add that a little bit, to the narrative, because I do think like the LGBTQIA community have a set of values, and the faith-based community have a set of values. But how do we bring those things to spaces like this to really understand that even though we've done some foolish things, I've heard about, conversion therapy in terms of electrocution, like electricity or something like that, at a forum that I went to. And I personally didn't know that some of these things were extreme. On the other end, I think that one of the things that, as we talk about this particular issue, I think one of the things that we also have to give the permission for the faith-based community to do is to open up their own dialogue with their children and with individuals who are members of their church, their parishes, and all of those sorts of things, to bridge understanding and to really, get into understanding what you're feeling, what do you understand about how long you've been feeling about this, all of those sorts of things. But there has to be conversation in order for there to be reconciliation. And so I just think both sides need to be heard in the narrative.
I'd like to just pick up on a couple pieces of that, because I'm a very active Christian person. And one of the things is that the faith-based community is not a homogeneous community, right? I think one of the narratives that is often forgotten is that there are many faith-based spaces that are open to the Soji community. There are lesbian ministers, there are gay priests. And so this idea that if we have a certain set of Christian values is automatically anti, I think that's one of the narratives that needs to be switched. For anybody who's interested, the HRC, the Human Rights Commission, hrc.org, has a Christian conversation guide that you can use in your churches, in your spaces, for exactly this. And it talks about how to have those conversations around the Soji community. There is the United Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches. There's Inner Light Ministries. There are Unity Fellowship in Church Movement Club. There are churches that are full of Soji people. And so I think part of the narrative that needs to be rewritten is that Soji persons are not faith people. I don't see it as either or. There is an intersectionality of that. And so when I think about my Christian faith, and you mentioned it beautifully about our values, that's exactly it for me. It's like, if as a person who believes that God created all of us, and as a person who believes that God gave us 10 commandments and we couldn't even get that right, so he just boiled it down to 2, love him and love our neighbor, well, then it's simple. Right? In the sense that I'm saying it's simple, not that but when you talk about your struggle, so then if I'm struggling with my gay brother, that has nothing to do about that. That's the human part of me, right? The God piece of me understands that all of us, what are we called to do? Right? It's one of those things where we as Christian people, the Christian faith, it is about and against discrimination, and it is about and it's against prejudice. And it has to be, it's about how we love each other and care for each other and give to each other and help each other. There's no pieces in there about beating each other and, calling each other out of our names and doing those kind of things. So I guess what I'm saying is, when I think about, you talked about it, what is your true value, right? What is the true core value? And what does that mean in our faith? And so I'm wondering if that's not the real narrative that needs to happen. Where in our faith does it dictate harming and hurting and killing our brothers and sisters? I don't see that in my faith. So I'm trying to understand that piece, right? So I think it's kind of like the slave masters used to hold church in the morning and then they would hang us in the afternoon. And they used Christianity as an excuse to uphold their discrimination and their prejudices and their stereotypes. It's that kind of thing. And I'm not saying it's easy. And I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying it in a judgmental way. I don't want it to come out that way. What I'm trying to say is we of Christian faith need to sit and have real conversations about why we are allowing ourselves to continue to be transphobic and homophobic. Like, where is that instilled in us? What is going on with that? And how does that balance with what God asks of us? Right? I think a real honest conversation around that, because a lot of people can use the Bible to uphold their own personal prejudices. And if you don't get into it yourself and you're taught that and heard it over and over again, then you can actually believe it's the Bible speaking to you.
Right.
I hope that kind of makes sense what I'm trying to say.
Oh, it absolutely
It's not an either or.
It
I would,
absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, Kishi.
no, I would just like to say, as an advocate in the community, I'm a sexual health educator. I've actually had very good experiences working with the faith-based community, especially on the topic of HIV in South Florida. A lot of Caribbean American and African American churches have sort of acted as gatekeepers between, you know, the nonprofit public health world as well as their communities. And the conversation can happen because there's also many people who are LGBT and still go to their family's church or place of worship,
Absolutely.
still celebrate holidays,
Absolutely.
and still uphold their faith, their religion,
Absolutely.
their spirituality, their relationship with God as something special. And there's a ton of, especially in Palm Beach, there's a lot of places of worship that are LGBT affirming or LGBT ran. And I've been to some of these spaces, and I think identifying who those gatekeepers are and connecting through faith, because if faith is the common ground, I think that's always a great way to unite people. Because if you have a person who is not of faith and is from the LGBT community, and you have someone from the faith community, there's not really much ground to walk on, and it does become judgment, and it does become sometimes unfair. Like I've heard a lot of from both ends, like definitely within LGBT community, a lot of people who, when their parents reject them, they usually reject everything that came with them. And unfortunately, I'm a very spiritual person. I've learned that religion is controversial, but I don't think the communities of faith are necessarily the issue. I think it's the individual, and you cannot punish a group of people, even though you are rejected by your parents or your family. We really have to be careful that we're not punishing groups of people for their beliefs. And like I said, I'm a person of faith. I'm very spiritual, and I've had great experiences connecting with these churches. And it's always surprising just the conversations we do have, what they do know about sex, and they almost allow us to talk about anything, and we're allowed to hand out contraceptives. But I do notice with a lot of the Caribbean American churches, there's some things that they still need to learn, and it takes time. But I love that I can walk into these places comfortably and be acknowledged as a human being. I used to be very afraid of those places because, you know, within the community, they're always like, they don't accept us, they don't accept us. You know, the things we tell ourselves, like a mantra, can really affect us and hold us back from having these very important relationships. But I've had some really great encounters with the faith community.
And statistics are changing, right? There was a poll done a couple years ago from the Support Public Religion Research that showed only 23% of Black Protestants, for example, believed in same-gender marriage. And that now has changed, and it's grown to 38%. And so part of the thing we have to recognize as well is that as time changes and generations change, things will change as well. And I really want to point out that I think where sometimes we could get in trouble is trying to convince other people to think like us, right? Like, this is a sin, it's not a sin. Da, 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 da. And I think if we could just talk to people on a different level, and what I have found, like when I'm doing this, is I just say, do you think every child has the right to go to school and not be harassed, right? Does every child have the right to go to school and not get beat up? And I've never met a person who hasn't been like, well, yeah, you know, does somebody have the right to go to work and do their work? And if they're doing their work properly, not get fired? People are like, well, yeah. And so if you can just talk even at that level, then we don't have to necessarily agree that this is or this isn't. We don't even have to talk about that. We can just talk about as a human being and as a Black person, that we deserve, every Black child deserves to go to school and not get bullied or harassed. Every one of us deserves to go ahead and have our jobs and work at them. And I think if we can talk like that,
Yep.
and we don't get, because I think people get caught down here, but if we can talk like that, then you would recognize then every Black life matters. Right?
Thank you all.
Okay.
I am enjoying this conversation. And if you are enjoying this conversation, please share this on your page so everyone can tune in. Just share, 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 because this is such an important topic. I want to thank the viewers that have tuned in tonight. Everyone saying hello, great conversation. I see Camilla Trapp made a comment on here. She says it's so extremely important to have that support and love for some parents. For some parents, I think it's a fear, embarrassment, faith in God, not understanding, and especially having exceptions for our kids. So thank you for that. I think everyone touched on this on the panel, and it's about the generation gaps, right? The difference in generations. So if I could tell you that my grandparents or parents, you can't have these conversations.
Not at all.
And they have their own beliefs, because I remember my grandma didn't even want a Rasta man coming
Right?
in
Right?
yard, right?
Yeah.
That was forbidden.
Yeah.
So you're talking about some really serious rooted issues.
Serious.
If you should come out back then as being gay. And then when I think of my generation, I still think that there's a lot of reservations growing up in Jamaica. And I think growing up in Jamaica, and now being a Caribbean American, I think completely different than if I was in Jamaica, because it's different, right?
Yeah.
And you're influenced by people around you. You're influenced by your leaders, your country. So it's still taboo, more taboo there than it is here.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I think of my kids now, like Kishi said, the younger generation, we're learning so much from them. It's like, it's a non-issue for a lot of them, even though we're not having the conversations unless someone approaches you as a parent and say, hey, this is how I feel, right? So we're talking about, have you seen that? Do you think if you were back in the Caribbean, for those of you from the Caribbean, do you think that it's such a difference with being in the Caribbean and being Caribbean American? And also as parents, are you seeing that in your families, the generation differences?
I see it happened for my father when he left Jamaica and came to the US. His mind shift changed drastically. And I do believe that there is a difference here. If one of my two sons came out as gay, I would tell them not to live in Jamaica now. I don't believe it would be safe for them. I would tell them to live in certain parts of the United States, because there's certain parts that are not safe for him. Canada is more accepting, but again, the same kind of conversation. I will tell you that when we did my son's kind of college tours at HBCUs, Morehouse College, this incoming class will be the first incoming class that has transgender men as part of their class. They already have a vibrant gay community. Spelman,
Atlanta.
also, Atlanta. Spelman also a couple years ago opened up to the Soji community as well. So that younger generation, they're making spaces for themselves in various places. And my child, who's 14, when he was, I think 12, he came home and he goes, Mama, there are 50 different genders. I'm like, really? And he goes, that's what I learned in school today. And everybody has their own washroom. And I'm like, okay, and the point was that it was part of his curriculum, that he's learning about that. There are clubs at his school. So I think in that sense, and on TV and in social media, there's a lot more visibility in that sense. But again, it's still pretty, I feel, white space. And that's, talking about the racism within the Soji community is a whole nother show. But there is a need for that as well. So there needs to be a bit more representation for sure. Not a bit more, a lot more. But a girlfriend of mine has written a set of children's books around SOGI issues, and this wasn't in existence a few years back, right? So yeah, that's what's happening, at least on my end as a parent, and also in terms of the differences between, say, Jamaica and being in the US or Canada.
Dr. Wright, same question. Are you seeing it with generational differences, the changes?
I definitely do believe that as time changes, as culture changes, there's a lot more, I guess, acceptability, or at least understanding. When you go generations back, and I've had conversations, you know, even with different, you know, political leaders and different things, and the older ones will flat out tell you, you know, if my kid came out to me, I would disown him. And I'm literally sitting there in shock. Like, what? Like, did you really just say that? But as you kind of come down into more my age range, you know, even in my mother, with my mother, she understanding, because we have a lot of conversations around social issues, around, you know, around faith, even around equity and all of those sorts of things. And I think that my being even in my mother's life in terms of exposure and conversation, and she's also a part of our ministry. And one of the things we actually did in our ministry was we took our ministers through like bias training, where they really began to identify where your hidden biases are, you know, on this whole list of everything. And a lot of times people don't even realize where they have these things at. But I think that there are two things that helps individuals to be able to really kind of understand the narrative better. One is education and exposure, you know, around that conversation. And as, like I said, time changes, there are some thought pattern changes, but definitely the older generation, for most of them, you can still hang it up. Like, it's not happening. And that's, you know, and that's just the honest truth. They don't even talk to you about it. Like, don't bring that to me. I don't want to hear about it. Yeah, like, they're very close. Like, listen, we're not even going there. So keep that over here. And, you know, that's where we are.
Yeah, I certainly couldn't have had that conversation with my my dad. Oh. There's no way. My grandparents, the grandma, even worse. Kishi, what are your thoughts on the generation differences?
It's interesting because I come across so many people within the LGBT community and outside of it, who have a range of opinions on the topic and a range of experiences. Talking about, for instance, one thing that really stands out to me is people who are in the closet, for instance. Yeah. While more people are coming out and they are coming out younger, there's still a great deal of people who are in the closet. Absolutely. And I find that especially a lot of the generation that came before me, many of them are and still are, and they're not able to live in their truth, and it's very oppressive. Yeah. While many people and I think with my generation and the generation after me, I think a lot more people they may not be open with their curiosity, because honestly, sexuality is a personal experience. It's an individual experience. It's not something that does need to be shared with the world. But wherever you fall on the spectrum of your sexual orientation, you're still a person who is valid and deserves to live a harm-free life. But I think that there are people in my generation and the generation after who are more open with their curiosity and fluidity. And even if it's not necessarily their own experience, I know way too many people who I come across that are not LGBT who already have like a relative or a friend who is going through transition or is openly queer. And that's beautiful because, you know, when I think about my experience as a kid, like I really didn't love myself because I saw so much negative experience, so many negative things. I internalized so much of what I saw, and I did not see someone who looked like me or thought like me. You know? And I think that there's so many people now who are in media and who are openly, even if they're not part of the LGBT community, even like just what Gabrielle Union, who's beautiful in person, I've met her, she's amazing, wow. Just even her like openly being supportive of her trans daughter, like that was like, wow, a lot of people look up to Gabrielle Union and see themselves as Gabrielle Union or would like to be like her. So the fact that she is able to publicly acknowledge, this is my child, I love my child, and I'm going to do what I can to protect my child. It was that, it's things like that that break barriers and make a difference and keep things moving forward. So yeah, like we're seeing a lot of change happening right now, and it's beautiful.
But Andrea Hall, your mom, says what's interesting. Thanks for tuning in, Andrea Fandango. She says what's interesting is so many are hiding fear of not being accepted and loved. And we touched on that. It's such a fear and judgment of what our friends are gonna say, or, you know, if my kid says that they're gay or lesbian, you know, how my friend's gonna think about it. It's that fear for it. So it does take someone, especially when you have a history of silence, like you love in silence, and, you know, to stand publicly and just embrace it. A lot of people will say Gabrielle Union's a celebrity, they have all the money in the world, they can live with that. So let's talk to the day-to-day family members, people, Caribbean, that, you know, this is rooted in our culture to not accept it at some level, right? So like we mentioned, living in America is so different than living in the islands today and being able to say my kid is gay and not fearing that what my friends are gonna think, or like you mentioned before, that they could end up dead, beaten. There are people that flee the country.
That's right.
Not just Jamaica,
That's right.
many Caribbean islands. And one of the
around
places
the world,
refuge is Canada. So I was reading on that. I listened to some videos, and that's what was mentioned. They're fleeing just to live life, to survive.
Well, what I'm also seeing is somewhat of an uprising in the Caribbean. There are, whether they're not in the Caribbean or whether they are, I do see that Jamaica's pride is growing. Also, there is a Caribbean American group in New York called the Caribbean Equality Project that I'm highly involved with. I'm one of the people who actually hosts and participates in a Caribbean Pride Fest here in South Florida. We were actually working on a Caribbean LGBT conference here in Miami, but due to COVID, we're putting that on hold. But I'm seeing a loud voice, a necessary voice, because at some point, the LGBT community in the Caribbean is not going to take the abuse anymore. And at some point, people are going to see what's happening, and there are people who are either going to object it, but there are people who are going to say, you know what, they're human too, or you know what, that's my brother, that's my sister, that's my grandpa. And I do believe that eventually there's going to be a time where every nation in the Caribbean is going to have to address sexuality, is going to have to address the LGBT community. And it's not that difficult, because no matter what people want to believe, they're already there. They're walking among all of you in the Caribbean. Every country around the world has people who are LGBT. And in the Caribbean, it is no different. They may hide, they may not, but my community, we are very resilient. Just like Black people are very resilient. We went through slavery, and slavery was not where our history begun, but that's what history books like to tell us. But still, Black people were able to survive slavery. LGBT Black people are the most resilient, influential folks. You know, look at what we're seeing on the television. We're seeing day to day the changes happening. But I do believe that when it happens in the Caribbean, it is going to be a game changer, because there is so much. Every person has some sort of value, brings something to the table. But when I tell you, the LGBT Caribbean people I know and that who have yet to come out, who might be somewhere in, I don't know, Trelawney, or somewhere in, San Juan, Trinidad, or somewhere in, in Santiago, Dominican Republic, wherever it may be. There are people who don't even have the terminology, don't even know how to recognize what is happening with them. But these people are beautiful, and these people are artistic, and these people are going through a lot. And when they are able to amplify their voice and get that platform, it is going to change lives. And it's happening now. People are going to turn a blind eye to it, but we're here. We're already here. We've been here.
2020
That's the thing, you've been there. You've been there.
Yeah.
So I know, Kishi, you wanted to talk about mental health, and I'm sure our other guests are going to chime in on this. Dr. Wright already mentioned about, a lot of the homeless that she's dealt with or spoken with, they've been rejected, and that's why they're homeless. And I'm sure that's around the world, because as parents, we've rejected our kids and sent them out on the street because we can't handle our own issues, our own biases. Because no matter what, like I think Kishi said this, no matter what the churches say, no matter what anyone says, it's you. It boils down to your household and how you're going to, whether it's for this particular topic or something else, how you're dealing with your issues. So Kishi, mental health, let's talk about that.
Well, I'm not a doctor yet. It's coming, it's happening.
Good.
But I'm someone who supports the study of psychology. I'm someone who's experienced trauma. And one thing I know is that as people of African descent, we have experienced trauma, not only through slavery, but just by existing and having our complexion. And sometimes it's very difficult for people to also understand that when a person is Black and LGBT, like I mentioned intersection earlier, that adds another layer of stigma and trauma and mental issues. Like I said, for me, being around people who look like me, but being constantly told from the age of 5 that, you're too feminine, you talk too proper, you're not Black enough, you're not Caribbean enough, you are nobody, you are nothing. To hear that for years and internalize that, it made me hate myself. And that is the experience that a lot of LGBT people go through. So in turn, many people do hide who they are, and they struggle with identity because the pressure to be a model person, or the pressure to live up to expectation of what your not even society, what your family wants you to be, it's very difficult. I know Black LGBT men, Black LGBT women, Black trans women, Black trans men. I know that when it comes to mental health, we grow up seeing relatives deal with mental illness. Like many of us have seen relatives who are down a lot, but we don't call it depression. We see relatives who are bipolar, and we push it over. We see a lot of addiction. We are violated by our own relatives, and we tell our parents, and we're not believed. So we're already, like Dr. Wright, you hit it on the nail when you said we don't know how to deal with conflict and resolution. We take on trauma, and there's no, it shows up in different ways throughout life, but there's never really a healthy outlet for it. It manifests internally and externally, and it shows in the way we interact and the way we show up in life, right? But I've gone through years of therapy, and I've had to talk about, like, regardless of having the family I have, outside of my family, the amount of verbal abuse and physical abuse and mental abuse and gaslighting that I've experienced just for my complexion, my heritage, and my sexuality. It's taken me a while to accept and be proud of, like, the fact that, you know, my heritage. Like, it was very difficult because for a while I felt I need to separate myself from Blackness because, you know, if I'm a Black man and I'm not masculine, I'm not desirable, you know, and within the LGBT community, especially because we're highly fetishized, you know, we have to be the strong
Black man.
BBC, you know, there's initials that stands for. It's not really appropriate to speak about on this medium, but fill in the blanks. But there's that expectation of being hypermasculine and very strong. And then among Black people, my slang is just not there. I'm vegetarian, like, you know, and that was a whole conversation about how Black folks all eat like chicken and stuff. And, you know, the things, like, there's so many things that we're taught externally. And then when we see that people who look like us and love us and are around us don't think that that's acceptable, they let it be known. They let it be known verbally, they let it be known directly, and sometimes indirectly. And so a lot of us do face a ton of issues. There's a ton of isolation. There's a lot of addiction. And that's why I just wanted to bring that up, because for a lot of LGBT Black folk and LGBT people of color, we constantly look for validation, and we constantly feel inadequate, and we just want to belong. Like, it's not about, oh, I want to just be with one community. We just want to belong, and we want to be in any space and not be afraid of being hurt or being attacked, because it happens on both sides. It happens among our families, and it happens when we're at Pride events. I mean, my first Pride event, I was told, can you teach me, by a white gay man, can you teach me how to shake my ass like a colored girl? And then the number of inappropriate things and inappropriate things, I've been touched inappropriately at events, but also among the Black community. Like, I have definitely faced homophobia 10 times more than I faced racism. Like, I mean, at 5 years old, I was called the F word, and that's what I was called every day through grade school. Like, there is hardly a day I remember by a Black person not being told that, you know, you're this, you're a sissy, you're a wuss, you're this, you're that. I've been pushed, I've had things thrown at me. I've been spat on, you know, by people who look like me. So I had to unpack all of that and come to terms with, but this is who I am. I tried to run from my identities for the longest. I used to tell people, I just want to be a human. I'm human, and I don't want to date anybody. Like, I tried. People were like, boy, please. I couldn't run anymore. I got very exhausted, and that's just the experience many of us have. But when we finally get to a place of self-love, it's beautiful, you know, because we're beautiful. We're beautiful, and we shouldn't deny. We shouldn't suppress and try to fall into a category. But when we do that, it's exhausting.
Yeah. And Kishi, I want to just thank you. I mean, I love you. You know, I love you. I'm getting teary-eyed listening to you just share what you've gone through, and I can't even begin to feel the pain that you experience going through this. And like you summed it up so well, you're just exhausted, right? Exhausted from dealing with it, you know. I am so sorry. My heart goes out. I am so sorry that you had to deal with it. but I also, in listening to you, know that you are impacting change by people listening to you and knowing what you went through, which was so wrong that, and I've said this before, like, we don't know why we go through something, but we say God didn't give it more than you can handle. And so you went through it for a reason, right? So I've talked about domestic violence from my dad. And, you know, now that I can talk about it on this platform, I know the impact that I can make to other people. So I thank you. Our viewers, everybody that will watch this is going to thank you just for your honesty in sharing what you did, as much pain as you went through. So thank you. Dr. Gunderson.
I just want to thank you as well, because I think one of the things that when we talk about this stuff is we forget that we're dealing with real people, right? This is not just a random 5-year-old. This is a 5-year-old child. This is a 7-year-old child. These 12-year-old who's, you know, we're doing that. And I think two quick points I want to make is how toxic masculinity and how kind of white supremacy that we've taken in as Black people has done such incredible damage to us as a community, in making us think so much that we have to be Black, and that's a certain type of box. We eat a certain way, we listen to certain music, we eat, you know, we talk a certain way, we dance a certain way, and if we are outside of that box, then we're not Black. We have to take and blow that completely up. We are a heterogeneous group of human beings. And as Black folk, we do all of it. And as long as we keep trying to define ourselves in these little boxes and not reminding ourselves that whatever voice comes out of this body is a Black voice. Why? Because it's coming out of this body, right? So it's that kind of thing, that you are Black enough, that there is no checkbox to being Black enough, that you, being of African ancestry, you are Black enough. And somehow we have to get that message across, and not, again, put up with putting ourselves in these little boxes that, frankly, the system has developed for us. Because it's so important to learn our history prior to us being kidnapped and brought over here and stolen. And then you would realize what diversity of people we were, of sexual orientations we were, of identities that we were. If you go all the way back, right? People really need to understand their history. I just want to say one thing to parents, though. It is our children, and I'm talking as a heterosexual parent now, it is our children who are beating up our other children, right? Racism is not a Black person's problem. That is a white person's problem to solve, right? So when you talk about homophobia, that is not something that gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, non-gendered persons, that's not their issue. That's our issue to solve. So if somebody's sitting here calling him at 5, the F word, which I know happens to so many kids, or your kid comes in at middle school talking about this gay kid and this, that, and the other, and you get called and your kid beat somebody up and you're like, it's good that you beat that gay kid. You see what I'm saying? That's us. So we need to have conversations in our house, no matter what your value system should be, in my opinion, that we don't beat other people up. We do not call people names. We do not do these things, no matter if we don't understand, don't agree, whatever, we don't do that. That is my biggest fear, that I would have raised boys that would have beaten up somebody because of that. That's disappointment, right? That is inexcusable. So I think I'm really hoping your viewers sit down and have conversations with each other. Like, that is not okay, because that is, people are carrying that in terms of mental wellness. They carry that with them, and it literally costs lives and years of heartache and pain brought on by other people. And we're the other people. We're doing this. And you can't say, well, then they shouldn't act that way in school. No, that's not it. Your kid shouldn't be putting their hands on anybody. What's wrong with you? I just want us to have that real deep conversation, because we're the ones who are doing that, and that's not okay.
Thank you, Dr. Gunderson. So well put. Yeah. We need to fix it as parents. Kishi, I just loved what you just said. And your mom says she loves you, Kishi. She put it in the chat.
She tells me every day, I love you too, Mom.
That's right.
She's so proud of you. I know she's happy
right.
that you're on here
I
tonight.
come from greatness. I do.
Just making difference and impacting lives, and we so appreciate you.
And Dom, can I just say one more quick thing? The generation thing, we have to be careful with that, because stats are still showing that a group like 40, 50, 60%, depending on where you live, are not coming out in school.
Yeah.
And so we can make this assumption that, oh, the younger generation, they just, no, you've got to talk to your kids, because especially if you have those views, you've translated those. So you have to be intentional to unravel that, you know?
Yeah. Dr. Wright, so some deep conversations.
Yes, the conversation is very deep, but I think it's very thorough. And I think, just some of the points that are being discussed tonight are so important. As a dean of a school, I definitely can attest to, the things that you wouldn't think kids would say at 5 and 6 and 7 years old, you're completely shocked. And I think that when we start talking about the expectation, I guess as Dr. Lisa began to talk about, that we have of these children, we literally do realize that this stuff starts at home. They don't come out thinking like this. This is a pattern. When you hear it, when you hear these young kids, with this aggressive behavior or resolving things a certain way, we then have to begin to also look at what is being communicated in the family unit. What kind of violence is in the family unit? What kind of aggression is in the family unit? What kind of language is in the family unit? And then a lot of times too, unfortunately, there's the other subset around this conversation where, there are gaming systems and things that kids are exposed to that also use this language from a play, the F this and the, oh, you're this, and you'll see bullying behavior projected in some of the games that a lot of these kids are spending the majority of their time on, because the one thing that we sometimes haven't addressed is that a lot of our kids are parenting themselves. And so, the overexposure to a number of things goes unchecked by the parental unit. And so a lot of what we have now as the outcome or the symptom of all of these things really begins from either a parenting model and verbal models that engineer our kids to think a certain way, or the absence of it. And we have a whole nother system that's parenting our kids. And I think that it is, I think that it's dangerous. I want to talk about too, one of the things that Kishi said, as he talked about all of his experiences and kind of all of the things that he went through, and I guess the counseling and all of these sorts of things. The reality is, though, is that it's very interesting to me that in the African American community, there is such a stigma on therapy and a stigma on counseling. So, and there is really this taboo and this code of silence that exists around this. And so a lot of children are going through whatever they're going through internally. They learn to stuff it. And by the time one set of trauma happens on another set of trauma, on another set of trauma, on another set of trauma, by the time they're able to discuss it, they don't even know where to start. Because I feel like that a lot of times with our kids, we teach them more how to be silent than we do how to than to have a voice. And so their voice is muffled at a very early age, and we don't hear, because there is a system of generational parenting, that still exists from the old school. You don't say anything, you don't question anything, so forth and so on. And I understand the structure and the balance of some of those things, but there is a reality that a lot of our kids are not as vocal as they can be, because we misinterpret their voice in a lot of different ways. And so things that we could know early, we don't know until a lot much later. But by the time later comes, there's so much inner turmoil, there is such an inner problem, and then Nobody wants to talk about it. And parents, even once they know and they don't know what to do with it, they are afraid to get counseling. There is a stigma on therapy in the Black community. Up until recently, even in some of the faith-based circles, like, you know, you just got to pray about it. You got to pray about it. You got to pray about it. It is just now where the door is becoming open to say, okay, I can have Jesus and therapy, or I might need Jesus and a pill, you know, but it took years, you know, to really understand that. We had to lose pastors in the pulpit. We had to suffer a lot of casualties for us to realize, you know what, we do need this. And I think that if we would start paying attention a lot earlier to some of this stuff, especially around voice, the lack of voice, stigma, communication, and therapy, then I think that we would begin to see a resolve around issues a lot sooner. So hats off to you, Kishi. And thank you for your perspective, Dr. Lisa.
And I'm glad you brought up therapy as well. We certainly struggle with therapy in the Caribbean community. It's just something we don't do. I think as parents overseas in America, we're more open to it. And I think Dr.
My mom,
Lisa,
absolutely,
yeah, Dr. Gunderson mentioned this before to me, and I forget the numbers, but the percentage of Black therapists out there is minimal as well. So one of the concerns is, how do our Black kids relate to a white therapist, or how does a therapist relate and understand what a Black kid and a cultural kid is going through as well? So Dr. Gunderson, can you talk more to that as well?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see a little bit in the West Indies, right, with the putting in psychology as a major, like at UE and so forth, that some of that is starting to shift, but there is a resistance to it. And also in the United States, and we have to admit that part of that resistance is valid. I mean, at one point in the psychological literature, drapetomania was a diagnosable mental illness for slaves that chose to run away, right? And then you think about things like the Tuskegee experiment. And so there is such a degree of systemic racism that has happened. And these institutions, psychology and so forth, were used to continue discrimination against us and subjugate us to a variety of different issues, that there is a reason also partly for that resistance.
medical mistrust.
Exactly. And it happens across a variety of different groups. But that being said, there's a lot of movement in space for that. The APA.org, I'd recommend to any of your listeners. They have a whole separate office of sexual orientation and gender diversity. They also have a whole section for African Americans. There's a ton of resources on there. Just go to that site to help. The Association of Black Psychologists. Many of us are members of the Association of Black Psychologists. There are local chapters in every state in the United States, and it becomes important to connect that way. Our challenge is we are not going to ever have a situation where we have a large number of Black psychologists, right? So the odds are when you go to therapy, you're going to go to somebody who is not Black. So on our end, trying to train these therapists properly, getting them to understand their own biases and how that might play out. So for example, a white therapist may say to a Black 18, well, go and demand your parents accept you. You need to just come out and explain it to them. I was counseling a young Latinx girl who really wanted to come out to her parents. She was 15, 16, and we had to realistically look at her family structure. In this case, highly Catholic. And she said, I can't wait. I want to tell them. It's like, well, what do you think they'll do? They'll probably kick me out. So before you tell them, let's set something up so you have a place to go and live just in case. And unfortunately, that was the outcome. If she couldn't keep it, like, can you wait till you're 18? No, I really can't. Okay. Well, she did. She got kicked out, but we had a place for her. So right. Those are the kind of things it's important that a therapist would understand the various cultures and the various dynamics and the intersectionalities when working with people, right? And so we need to just step up on our training with therapists from graduate school on, have them check their own biases. But all of that being said, we have got to somehow engage people in mental wellness care. And maybe it's not one-on-one, maybe it's with groups, because we don't like coming to us. So we need to bring psychology out. So if we as psychologists can start having more groups, if we as psychologists can start to, do Zoom calls or do things in a way that people could do it privately, like set up workshops and you could do it on your own, things like becoming really creative. It would become really, really important for us to be able to do that. Yeah.
I would love for you to start that, Dr. Gunderson, because one of the challenges is the cost of going to therapy.
Especially in the US. Yeah.
Yeah. And with COVID-19, I just think the privacy that people would get from being able to do it online, the minimal cost versus, $150 or an hour or whatever it is. Yeah. Our community needs that as help. And I know you have your website, so let us know when that's started.
Well, on the website right now, I just did a series on COVID with the indigenous sports and recreation, and they've just made that live on YouTube. And it's looking at parenting during COVID. It's looking at anxiety and depression during COVID, and just going forward. And that's on YouTube right now. And a lot of the resources that I mentioned there are available, and that they're free, and there are ways for you to access that as well. And again, any therapists out there, don't forget, you don't need a psychologist. Many of us who are racialized are social workers. So there's social workers, and there's marriage and family therapists, and there's different types of people who do counseling. There's religious counseling, faith-based counseling as well. So there's different types of counseling that you can access. And I'm asking therapists out there to think about things like, I'm going to start a racialized violence group for those who've had racialized violence happen to them, right? And when we do groups, that's less costs. And it's also community. Wow. And it's more the way that we do things, right? But it really does require a lot of roads. And the key one is training of current counselors, therapists, in understanding us as a people and how diverse we are and the intersectionalities. That's key. They've got to get continuous training all throughout school. That's what I think we should fight for.
Thank you. So just switching to our viewers, thanking our viewers again for tuning in. I do see one from Karine who says we must prioritize things and choose our battle because we have a lot on our plates: poverty, lacking education, opportunities, justice and equality, social integration, domestic violence, massive incarceration, sexual orientation. What should be our priority? It sounds like everything on that list.
Collective.
Can I just make a statement around that? Because 32% of persons who identify in the LGBTQ community, for example, live in poverty versus say 13% of heterosexual, right? And if you look at 34% of trans persons who are Black, they live in extreme poverty compared to 9% of Black persons, right? So what I'm trying to say is, whether you do poverty, whether you do education, whether you do transportation, careers, you can never forget this group of people, that this group of people are getting it even worse than not. So if you're going to go after poverty, go for it. But please don't forget the Soji community in that, right? If you're going to go after bullying in the schools, anti-racism in the schools, you can't do that without also going after anti-transphobia and anti-homophobia in the schools, because it's not just our Black children that are getting it, but our Black gay children get it worse. So it's, you don't need to choose, I guess is what I'm saying. And when you prioritize based on what you feel is important to you, because that's the passion you're going to go for. But when you do, don't forget all Black people, right? Don't forget all of us.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
I just, I love what you said. And no, it's true. Social determinants is something that we often discuss a lot in my field. These are aspects of the individual's existence or life that may hold them back from living the healthiest life they can. These things could be anything from their education, employment, transportation. These are things that do get in the way of people accessing medical care and advancing. So these things, there's a number of social determinants that can hold people back from even being able to be on the playing field, even from just being able to exist and thrive in the world. So I wouldn't say that there's necessarily one area that needs focus because each individual has one or many barriers, and the barriers do have to be addressed, but it doesn't have to be one at a time. Because, for instance, something like education, like an individual who isn't educated and doesn't have transportation, what opportunities are out there for them? So there's two things you have to address there, which are huge, but they're important. So you can't focus on one only and ignore the others. Like, all of these things add up, and they're all worth giving attention to. And
I just wanted to add just one thing that I don't want to be missed, and that's our seniors in this group. My mother lives in a care facility because she has Alzheimer's and dementia. And one of the things that we're seeing is that older persons who are gay, lesbian, transgender, on the spectrum, that many of them are having to kind of go back into the closet. And some of them are being very mistreated because the people who are treating them may have biases against them. And this is a very vulnerable group of people. Absolutely. And I just want you to kind of imagine what that would be like for people who carry those biases with them. And now they're caring for somebody like, say, my mom, who can't tell me what's going on, right? I am trusting her to these people. She can't tell me what's going on because her memory lasts for less than 40 seconds. But we know that there's abuses that are happening, and this particular population is quite vulnerable to abuses in our senior care. So I really want, a lot of times we focus on the youth and young people. We have to understand this goes all the way up to our elders. And what do they deserve? And do they deserve?
And those who are not able-bodied also.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you for that point. It's so valid, Lisa. Thank you. I do have a question. It's not directed to anyone in particular, but this is from Dawn Ellis Gale. Thank you. She said, sometimes parents don't want their children to be hurt by society, yet you want them to be themselves. Mm-hmm. So if they come out and they're being themselves.
Yeah. That's real. I think, I mean, I'm a mom of 2 Black boys. That's real, right? Mm-hmm. And if I could maybe keep them locked up in the house forever, but you can't, right? That's not real. However, I think she's making a really valid point, and one that I had said earlier. Like, if one of my sons says I'm gay, I honestly right now would say, no, I don't want you living in Jamaica, right? Like, you can't be fully who you are. Things are changing, but you can't be fully who you are, be able to live the kind of life that you want to live. And that wouldn't be that, yeah. So I would say to her, I think she's right. I think the challenge is allowing your child to be who they are, and also training them on how to keep safe. And I think that's the piece. So he's going to have to figure out, and they're going to have to also navigate that. Let's say they're in a town where everybody hates gay people. Well, then maybe you're going to need to move, right? And these are things that parents are like, well, but it's not because it's inconvenient, but because it's necessary, right? So I'm not going to let my child stay in a school where he's getting tortured and beaten, for every single day for 4 years. Say if I know that for whatever reason that it's happening, and I go to the school and they're not going to do anything, and the principal doesn't do anything, and the school board doesn't do anything. Well, I'm in the wrong town. And so, and I'm not saying that's easy at all. And some people can't leave because of work and other things like that. So then maybe I have to homeschool him, or maybe I have to drive him 45 minutes to a different space. But what I'm saying is that she's right. I think we go through this though as parents all the time, is if something is happening to our child, I don't think the answer is to have the child hide who they are, but it's to figure out how to teach them how to be safe, when and where and how, and what that looks like. And then the kind of communities we're in, as much as we can, protect them in terms of who we hang out with, and which neighborhoods we go to, and where we are going to be. I think that's the balance that we all have to face. Yeah.
Thank you. And Yvonne Hope Barnett says, but sometimes the parents are not aware it's kept hidden.
Yeah.
And I think more
That's
times
true.
it's kept hidden.
Yep.
That is absolutely true.
Here.
That is absolutely true. And no matter how many times, I think that the best that we can do as parents is just continuously repeat, sweetie, anything you can tell me, anything, and I'll be here for you. But kids kind of know, really? Are you just saying that? And it's not just saying it once, but over and over again, and in your actions. Or you see a story on the TV and say, look at what happened with that kid. That was happening to him at school. I hope if that ever happens to you, you would say something to me. I mean, all you can do is, use music, use books. Like, all you can do is keep trying to say that and hope that they will. But there are times that they won't, and the best you can do is just keep, I think, repeating the message over and over again, and showing through your actions that you really mean that. And yeah, I wish
Your
I had a better
action certainly
response.
speaks louder than words, right?
It really, really does.
Does, right? Even if
So,
you're verbalizing it,
yeah,
who you allow around you in your
yeah,
circle of friends. If your kids
exactly,
don't trust that circle or respect
exactly,
that circle, how could they have this conversation with you? If your friends
exactly.
feel that way. I know as a Caribbean parent, I'm labeled by my kids to see how open I am, because they do say that you Jamaicans are rough. and even though I'm not rough with them at all, it's that Caribbean label that comes with me as a parent.
Well, I tell that to my kids all the time. I'm kind of like, when they do something, I go, what kind of mama do you have? They're like, a black mama. I go, that's right. And so I feed off of that a little bit, but that's a loving all purpose thing, but no, you're right. It is in your actions. If you're saying one thing, but then giving jokes and letting your friend, and you're not stopping friends when they, talk about, well, if my child did this, you're like, they're hearing that. So they're not going to trust you.
And then Kishi, we had this conversation before about our music and the lyrics, and that's worldwide, not just in reggae.
Exactly.
Right.
That's worldwide.
So we've seen a lot of artists come out and apologize and also change their message in their music. Because it was very violent, talking about killing.
Oh yeah.
The different terminologies used there. So I think, and Kishi, we know you love your music, and you yourself said you dance them because it's all about the rhythm. And,
and the thing is, Caribbean music, no matter if it's Spanish, French, English, I honestly love it all. Like I love Zouk from Haiti. I love Dembow from Dominican Republic. I love Chutney and Soca from Trinidad and Barbados and all those places. But it does bother me a lot when I still hear songs from like TOK and Buju, and we love Buju. We all love Buju, right? But you know, these songs are like ingrained and embedded in the mind of the public. And unfortunately, like as a Caribbean American person, it's so crazy. You know, people don't understand how proud I am of my heritage, but then they're like, but Jamaicans hate gay people. Like it's always because of that music. It definitely painted a picture, not just of Jamaicans, but of Caribbean people. And a lot of the actions in the Caribbean community support those statements. And it's unfortunate because let's be real, Caribbean music, Caribbean culture is very influential worldwide. And when people hear certain things or see certain things, you know, they're like, they take it as this is the collective. Like they see the entire culture as a monolith. They think that we all feel the same way. And they can't imagine like, okay, so how are you like openly out and Jamaican? Like, doesn't your family hate you? Like, it's crazy. I have to have these conversations with people.
But I can tell you, Kishi, that conversation we had changed how I listen to that music, right?
Yeah.
I've never listened to those songs the same way because you kind of dance and you love the rhythm and you just love the music and you grow up on it, right? But I can tell you people were more aware of the lyrics or the not accepting of it, right? And a lot of artists were actually banned from performing in different countries
because it's violence, right?
It's violence.
Yeah, it's absolute violence.
We wouldn't want to hear a song about Black people being murdered or hurt. We definitely don't want to hear about women being hurt, even though I have a huge issue with, you know, still this ever lingering femme bashing, sexism and misogyny that is in a lot of our music too. That's something that's another conversation. But that's something actually that still is relevant to the LGBT and the Black conversation, because I do feel that feminine presenting people are not seen as valuable. You know, that I think a lot of the reason why there is so much transphobia is because they see someone who is assigned male at birth. Why would you want to dress up as a woman? You know, like they definitely feel that masculinity. First of all, I just want to let viewers know, there is nothing wrong with masculinity. But when masculinity is used as a weapon to silence somebody or exert force or power over someone, that's when it's an issue. You know, I see men and women as equal. And I think that we see many times how it's so much more, it's easier for people to digest a woman in pants and a baseball jersey. Like women are allowed to often be more masculine presenting, but it isn't the same way around. Like, you know, trans women do get a lot of hell just because they feel people who are cisgender and not trans and not LGBT, they think if you are a man, you need to present as a man. Why would you ever want to do anything feminine? You are a threat to masculinity. And there are people who believe that masculinity is under attack and, you know, that there is an agenda, there's a gay agenda, but LGBT people are a minority, you know, and masculinity is not going anywhere. It is not under attack. Like masculinity pretty much dominates society. It's just that the music, whatever messaging it has an impact. And, you know, but I would love to, I do see a change happening in society. I do see more representation. I would just love to see it in the Caribbean, you know, because for instance, last year we talked about Jussie Smollett, who is one of the first people who I looked at and I was like, oh my God, like, this is my hero. Like I met him and then unfortunately that incident happened. I still have love and respect for him because still that was one of the few people on television where I was like, I see somebody, I see myself in someone, I see my future, right? There's Moonlight, that was an amazing movie. Pose, I love that show, you know? So there's representation out there. And for me, it's better than, you know, the in Living Colors,
Right.
you know, Deformation, and, you know, hated it, and, you know, all like Mo Money with that very feminine guy who was just a mess, but a fabulous mess. You know, I think there is more representation in a wide variety, and it's necessary. Like, I love seeing Laverne Cox. I love seeing Dominique Jackson on Pose, India Moore on Pose, MJ Rodriguez on Pose. I love Billy Porter. I love seeing these people in media doing great things. I love seeing Moonlight in all of this, but in the Caribbean, it is happening soon, and I cannot wait. It's gonna come. There's gonna be an artist or a movie from the Caribbean, and it's gonna be unapologetically LGBT, and I'm ready for it. I will donate. I will donate.
And I see, you know what I see, Kishi? I see Kishi Chad on the Caribbean edge impacting change. People want to see someone just like them that they can relate to,
Absolutely.
not just a movie star. So thank you, you're impacting change.
Yeah.
So we're gonna wrap it up and just give us your final thoughts on what this conversation meant to you as far as do all Black Lives Matter. And we're gonna go to Dr. Ursula Wright.
Once again, I want to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to be on here with amazing people. But I think my final thoughts and conclusions is that all Black lives absolutely do matter. And this is pretty much my bridge, you know, to the faith community, at least those that, you know, are still closed to conversation and closed to education, to really broaden our perspectives and to understand the necessity for not just conversation and dialogue, but reconciliation, healing, as well as being a part, I think, of the political change that's needed around healthcare, education, and some of those very key points when we just look at civil rights and human rights really across the board. And so I'm really appreciative of the opportunity just to learn, you know, even as much as I've talked. It's always an awesome place when you can sit and you can hear diverse perspectives, different experiences, because it always lends something to your own thought patterns that you can also take back, that I can also take back, you know, to my community and to my colleagues, so that we can continue the forward movement. So thank you again. All Black lives do matter.
Thank you. Dr. Gunderson?
I just want to thank all of you for being here. I just love the fact that we're able to represent and show kind of the world through this platform, that we are a heterogeneous group of human beings and that we love each other. That's what I feel off of this, is just such a great degree of love. And I really want to just, again, you know, think about the Christian Conversation Guide from hrc.org. If you're a person of faith, I really would love for you to consider having these conversations, you know, amongst just even one other person, and talk about how we can, as a people, stop, you know, and end violence and fear and discrimination, and that, yeah, that we can do all of that. And again, Kishi, you're just awesome. And I completely agree with Dawn that I think your voice is so important and gives voice to so many other people. And the person maybe you were looking for at 5, 7, 9, 12 is you. You're that for a current 5, 7, 9, 12. And so I thank you for just doing the work that you needed to do to be able to be here and to be able to give that to others, and not just others like yourself, but all young Black persons out there who need a role model. I think you are that for all of them. So I just really appreciate that. And to please remember, every Black life matters. Every Black life matters. And all of us should be fighting for every one of us in our community.
And Mr. Kishi Chad.
So I want to thank everyone for watching. I want to thank you all for being a part of this with me. Thank you all for being with me on my journey of just loving myself more, loving my Blackness, accepting my Blackness, but also loving and accepting my queerness. And there's just two things that I want to shed light on really quickly. Through the protests happening due to the unfortunate death of George Floyd, we did have an attack on a Black trans woman, Ayanna Dior, in Minneapolis while the marches was happening. This individual was attacked by several people at a convenience store. Videos were circulating all over the place. So even though Black Lives Matter protests are happening, we're still seeing the murder and the abuse of Black trans people, and that's unacceptable.
Unacceptable.
Also in Tallahassee, the same week that George Floyd died, a Black trans male, Tony McDade, was murdered and by a police officer. There has been a great growing support for this individual. Actually, in Brooklyn, there was a Black Trans Lives Matter parade that had at least 10,000 people there.
Good.
And it was led by Black people who are LGBT. So I do see changes happening, but we still have a long way to go. I love you all. God bless you. I am proud to be a Jamaican. I am proud to be LGBT, and I'm alive. I'm here, y'all. I'm here.
Thank you, Kishi. I want to thank all our viewers who tuned in today, everyone that shared it and that's going to share this episode, because it's so important for us to have these conversations. I want to thank personally Dr. Ursula Wright for joining us because it's so important for us to get different perspectives, like you said. And so it's just it's just so important that you are here tonight to just give us your perspective from a Christian standpoint, from an educational standpoint as well. And so we can't thank you enough, because you're non-Caribbean as well. And so living in America, being born in America, it's very important that we see that this is a worldwide issue. So we thank you for that. Dr. Lisa Gunderson, my cousin, I always love you. Always so expressive, always doing so much for the community. We can't thank you enough for joining us and for sharing your expertise and your encouragement that we need to continue to love each other. And Kishi, what can I say about you? I just love you. I love your mom. And I am overjoyed and thankful that you're impacting lives, like I said, and like Lisa so eloquently said as well, is, you know, you are that person, that's that 5-year-old, 7-year-old, 10-year-old. We don't need a celebrity. You are that person. People want real people that they can relate to. So thank you all. Thank our viewers. And thank you once again for joining the Caribbean Edge. One love.
Thank you all. I love you, Mom.
Thank you, Don.
Bye.
One love.
God bless.
I think I ended.